London, May 1960. She does not call a publicist. She does not telephone his lawyers. She picks up a pen and she writes it herself. 42 words. Lady Olivier wishes to say that Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce in order to marry Miss Joan Plowright. She will naturally do whatever he wishes. The newsrooms ran it verbatim. Every editor in London held that sentence and felt the wire running through it. She had named him. She had named the other woman. And she had done it in the language of perfect compliance. She will naturally do whatever he wishes. So precise, so controlled, that no one could touch it without making it worse. She released that statement while burn marks from electroconvulsive therapy were still healing on her temples. While Laurence Olivier was already building his new life with a woman 25 years younger. While she was in the middle of a breakdown that had been years in the making. She was 46 years old. She was out of patience for the soft version. What that sentence cost her to write, and what it took to be the woman who wrote it, is the story we are here for. You are watching Old Money Scandals. Stay with me through every act. Because this story does not end where you think it does. She was born on November 5, 1913, Guy Fawkes night, the night the English burned things. Her name was Vivien Mary Hartley, born in Darjeeling, India, to a Yorkshire father and an Irish mother with roots that may have included Armenian blood. A detail she was later pressured to obscure because Hollywood had no use for complexity. She learned early. Present only what the world is willing to see. Keep the rest for yourself. She was 6 years old when her parents sent her to boarding school in England. 2 years passed before she saw her mother. 2 years is a long time to be without the person who is supposed to be your anchor. Long enough, perhaps, to learn that love and abandonment can live in the same house. She enrolled at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London in 1932, at 18. Within the same year, before she had finished the program, she met Herbert Lee Holman, a barrister, 13 years older, a man who actively disapproved of theatrical people. She married him anyway. She took his middle name, dropped the Holman, and became Vivien Leigh, a name she would carry through everything that followed, long after she had any reason to. In October 1933, she had a daughter, Suzanne. She loved her daughter. She also could not stop wanting the stage. Not because motherhood had failed her. Not because Holman was unkind. By most accounts he was devoted, if limited in his understanding of who she actually was. She wanted the stage because she was too large for the life that had been arranged around her. Everyone who ever watched her work seemed to understand this instinctively, even before she had fully proven it. The director who gave her her first London role in 1935 watched her in rehearsal and reportedly said she was going to be a problem, the complimentary kind. By 1937, she was cast as the female lead in Fire Over England. That was the year she met Laurence Olivier. He was already celebrated, already married to actress Jill Esmond, with whom he had a young son named Tarquin. Vivien was already married to Holman, with Suzanne at home. Neither marriage survived the introduction. Vivien was the great passion of his life. Kendra Bean, author of Vivien Leigh, an intimate portrait, has said plainly. And he was the love of hers. They had an affair. Both marriages dissolved. And on August 31, 1940, in Santa Barbara, California, Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier were married. They were, from that morning forward, the most famous couple in the English-speaking world. The press called them the royal family of British theatre. They moved into Notley Abbey, a restored medieval estate in Oxfordshire, complete with a walled garden and a moat, and the guest book that accumulated over their years. The reads like the credits of the 20th century itself. Noel Coward, Ralph Richardson, Marlene Dietrich, Vivien's old-school friend Maureen O'Sullivan, with whom she had first confided her ambition to become a great actress when they were girls together at the convent school. Vivien ran Notley with the same precision she brought to everything she loved. Flowers in every room arranged correctly. Meals prepared with intention. The house perpetually ready for whoever arrived next. She spoke multiple languages. She had a photographic memory. She could read a script once and hold every line. She owned more than 150 pairs of gloves, partly because she was self-conscious about her hands and partly because she simply loved beautiful things and believed they mattered. She also had 2 Academy Awards. The first came in 1940, for Gone with the Wind. She had crossed an ocean to audition. She had read the novel and decided the role was hers before anyone had offered it. She walked onto that backlit and she won the part over hundreds of candidates in the most heavily covered casting process in Hollywood history. The New York Times film critic wrote that she was so perfectly designed for the part by art and nature that any other actress in the role would be inconceivable. She was 26 years old, and she became, overnight, one of the most recognized faces on the planet. The second Oscar came in 1952 for A Streetcar Named Desire, opposite Marlon Brando. Tennessee Williams attended rehearsals and said she had brought to Blanche Du Bois everything that I intended, and much that I had never dreamed of. She was paid $100,000 for the film, more than Brando, and more than any British actress in Hollywood history to that point. She was the first British actress to win the Academy Award for Best Actress. First, ever. She had built something enormous. She had built it out of intelligence and discipline and the kind of physical beauty that made people forget to breathe, and she had protected it, all of it, while managing an illness she could not name publicly, in an era that had no treatment for it that didn't leave scars. For 20 years she kept the scaffolding standing. But it was not going to hold forever, and before the decade was out, they would call her to account for the falling. There is no clean way to describe what manic-depressive illness looked like in Vivien Leigh's time, because the era had no clean language for it. The diagnosis shifted depending on who was doing the diagnosing. Olivier believed she was schizophrenic. Some doctors called it manic depression. Her own mother refused to call it anything. She told Vivien's daughter, when an episode occurred, that it was simply artistic temperament. That is the phrase the world used when it didn't want to name a thing true. What it actually was: bipolar disorder. Severe, cyclical, and in the 1940s and 1950s, almost entirely untreatable in any way that did not cause further damage. The signs had been visible since childhood. A schoolmate described it precisely in terms that biographers have returned to repeatedly. Vivien would get along fine for a few weeks, a few months, be perfectly normal and friendly. Then, suddenly, a complete turnaround. We'd see a completely different girl. Moody, silent, petulant, rude, often hysterical. That schoolmate was describing a child. The child grew up and the episodes grew with her. By her late 30s, the stable intervals were contracting. During a manic episode, her agent said, her voice would turn hard, rasping, contemptuous. Her eyes would transform into what those closest to her called the eyes of a stranger. She would black out. When she came back, and she always came back, she had no memory of the episode. She would feel afraid, humiliated, and devastated. It was as though something else occupied her body and left her to face the wreckage alone. There was no lithium. Lithium would not come into widespread clinical use for years. What the doctors offered was electroconvulsive therapy. Electric current passed through her brain. While she was sedated, the ECT burned her temples. It scorched her hair so severely she wore wigs for the rest of her life. And Laurence Olivier would write later in his autobiography, in print under his own name, that the treatments had erased the best parts of her. He wrote that, about his wife, about something the doctors did to her while she was in their care. And he published it. She kept performing. Consider what this looked like from the inside of their marriage. In the stable periods, she was everything. She ran Notley. She managed the careers, the social calendar, the professional image of what the world understood as one of the great theatrical partnerships of the century. She was, by the accounts of everyone who dined at that table, slept in those guest rooms, received those letters, incandescent, funny, precise, the most interesting person in the room, which in that company was saying something. And then the episodes would come. Olivier wrote about this in his autobiography, and for all that the framing serves him, the description of what he witnessed is not easy to dismiss. He wrote of watching her possessed by something that wore her face but had discarded her behind the eyes. He wrote of the vertigo of loving someone who could, at intervals, become a stranger. He wrote that he had lost Vivien long before he left her, that the illness had taken pieces of her, one episode at a time, until he was grieving someone who was still in the room. That account is self-serving. It centers him. And it is probably also, in some measure, true. What it does not account for is what she was doing during the same period. Managing the episodes without medication. Working through tuberculosis, diagnosed in 1944, when she was 31, following a collapse during a wartime volunteer tour in North Africa, carrying simultaneously a public identity so burnished and controlled that the world had no idea any of this was happening. Biographer Alan Strachan interviewed people who worked with her, knew her, performed beside her, and found that nearly all of them said the same thing. She had concealed the illness almost completely from everyone except Olivier. She was protecting him. She was protecting the marriage. She was protecting an image that had become, over 20 years, the primary thing the public associated with both their names. In early 1953, Vivien was sent to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to film Elephant Walk with Peter Finch. Olivier had been worried for months. He had confided his fear to Noel Coward the year before in Jamaica. Coward wrote in his diary that after a long conversation with Vivien, he too was alarmed. The telegrams she was sending from Ceylon in early 1953 confirmed what both men feared. The break happened on set. She was removed from the production. Elizabeth Taylor was flown in to replace her. Vivien was put on a plane back to England and committed to the Northern Asylum in Colston, Surrey, described in contemporary accounts as exclusive, though what that meant in practice was that Olivier paid for private treatment. The treatment was cold, wet bedsheets, ice baths, more ECT. She had also, during the Ceylon production, been having an affair with Peter Finch. When she came home, she told Olivier. He did not leave, but something calcified in him that could not be undone. She had one problem with the years that followed. She refused to disappear. By 1958, Vivien Leigh understood that her marriage was functionally over. She did not understand it the way a woman understands something she has been told. She understood it the way a woman understands something she has watched happen, slowly, over years, while both people involved continued pretending otherwise for the sake of the public and their careers and the medieval estate in Oxfordshire that cost money to maintain. Olive, you flew to New York in early 1958 to film The Entertainer on Broadway. Before he left, he had done something quiet and devastating. He had gone to Vivien's close friends and asked them to look after her. He told them why. He would not be coming back to the marriage. He had fallen in love with Joan Plowright, his co-star, 25 years younger than Vivien, and when he returned to London, it would not be to Vivien. He asked her friends to be there for her. He asked them, in effect, to absorb the impact of what he was about to do. The friends did not tell Vivien immediately, but Vivien already knew. She went on performing. Duel of Angels, touring London and then Broadway. The burn marks from ECT still faintly visible on her temples if you were standing close enough. The tuberculosis that had been diagnosed in 1944 and supposedly resolved, not as resolved as the doctors had believed. Her body was fighting on two fronts. She performed anyway. Think about what that performance required. Every night she walked onto a stage, in a costume, under lights, and she inhabited a character while her marriage was ending and her lungs were weakening, and the man she had loved since 1937 was rehearsing a different life. Every night she walked off the stage and went back to a dressing room and a hotel room and the silence of a private life that had almost no architecture left. And then she learned her lines for the next night. She did not cancel performances. She did not issue statements about needing time to focus on her personal situation. She did not disappear into a villa somewhere and wait for the dust to settle. She went on stage. This is not a small thing. This is, in fact, the essential thing. Because the narrative about Vivien Leigh wants her to be a casualty, wants the illness and the abandonment to add up to defeat. And they did not. Not while she was alive. When Olivier finally told her directly that he wanted the divorce that it was Joan Plowright she received. It, according to Tarquin Olivier, Laurence's son from his first marriage, with extraordinary initial composure. She was calm, sane. She received the news quietly. 2 nights later, she broke open. What happened that night is documented in Olivier's own autobiography. She struck him with a wet towel. He struck her in return, hard enough that she fell and hit her eyebrow on the corner of a marble bedside table. The corner missed her temple by inches. Each of us, he wrote, was quite capable of murdering each other. That night he left. The choice that remained for Vivien Leigh was the one that remains for every woman in that position, in every era, in every language. What do you say? When the man who has defined your public life and your private self walks out the door to build a new life with someone younger, what do you say? You could say nothing. Many women say nothing. It is the safer choice. It keeps the narrative controlled by the people who benefit from the silence. She sat with that question. She thought about composure and what it costs. She had spent 20 years performing composure for the benefit of a marriage, a career, a public. She knew how to do it. She had done it with ECT burns on her temples. She had done it at film premieres and stage curtain calls and dinner parties at Notley, where the evening had to be perfect regardless of what the afternoon had been. She knew how to hide things. She chose not to. She chose her words. And she sent them. May 1960. Vivien is on Broadway in Duel of Angels. Olivier is in London in Rhinoceros. An ocean between them and everything else. She does not wait for his team to draft something diplomatic. She writes the statement herself and releases it under her own name. Lady Olivier wishes to say that Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce in order to marry Miss Joan Plowright. She will naturally do whatever he wishes. Read each clause separately. Feel what she built. Lady Olivier, the title used once deliberately. She had earned that title. It was hers by 20 years of marriage and by the knighthood the crown bestowed on Olivier in 1947, which made her formally Lady Olivier. She used it in the statement. She would never use it again. Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce in order to marry Miss Joan Plowright. She did not say has requested. She did not say has expressed a desire to separate. She said has asked for a divorce. In order to marry. The reason is in the sentence. The other woman is named. In public. In writing. On record. He'll naturally do whatever he wishes. The word naturally, she placed it there the way a surgeon places a blade. Every expectation that had ever been placed on her, every time she had been asked to absorb something quietly and gracefully and without making a scene, she folded it into one adverb and handed it back. The newsrooms printed it verbatim. They had to. It was already done. Olivier's statement was released the same day. Contained 43 words, if you are being generous. It said the matter was too private an affair to discuss just now, and that he must think. He must think. He had been thinking about this for at least 2 years. He had already told her friends. He had already made his choice. And when the moment came to stand in the record beside her, he had 43 words. She had 42 words. Hers contained everything. Permanently. What the press did with her statement in the days that followed tells you something important about how power protects itself. Time magazine ran a brief item. It noted that the couple had agreed to part for keeps. It described Vivien's statement as characteristically composed. The stiff upper lip of a British lady managing a difficult situation with grace. The word grace did a lot of work in 1960. It was the word that turned a woman's precision into a performance of good manners, and drained the wire right out of it. Olivier's statement. It is too private an affair to discuss just now. I must think, was treated as the statement of a thoughtful man wrestling with private grief. The contrast went unremarked. He was given interiority. She was given composure. Joan Plowright's name, which Vivien had placed in the first sentence of the first public document about this divorce, was absent from most follow-up coverage within 48 hours. Not suppressed exactly, just not repeated. The way a publicist doesn't need to make a call if editors already understand what the story is supposed to be. But Vivien put it there, first, before anyone could manage the narrative into something else. She had named Joan Plowright, first name, last name, in the document that would be quoted in every subsequent biography, every archive, every historical account of this marriage. Every softening that followed had to work around the fact that the original statement was precise. They could move the name to the margins. They could not remove it from the sentence. No one objected. The record held. There is a thing Vivien Leigh said in interviews in the years before the divorce that nobody quotes as often as they should. I have read the accounts of her illness multiple times. And this is the moment that changes everything about how you understand the rest. She was asked about playing Blanche DuBois, the role that won her the second Oscar. The role Tennessee Williams said she made entirely her own. The role she had originated on the West End stage in 1949, 326 performances, and then carried into the film opposite Marlon Brando. She said, "Playing Blanche DuBois tipped me over into madness." She said that, in public, to journalists who were asking about her greatest professional triumph. She was not being dramatic. She was not performing vulnerability for an audience that expected it. She was making a statement of fact with the same economy she used in everything. She played a woman losing her mind, and it cost her something she could not fully recover. She said so. She named the cost. She put it in front of anyone with a pen and a press pass who was paying attention. At a time when the stigma around mental illness was so severe that her own mother would not acknowledge it. At a time when Vivien herself was, according to biographer Alan Strachan, terrified of any public mention of her condition, she looked at a journalist and said, "This is what it did to me." That was not weakness. That was the most controlled thing she could have done. The courtroom went quiet. The judge wrote it down. The final thing the record contains is not a quote. It is a fact. Between 1960 and 1967, Vivien Leigh did not stop. She performed Duel of Angels in London and New York. She made The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone in 1961, in which she gave a performance critics called one of the finest of her career. She won the Tony Award in 1963. She made Ship of Fools in 1965 with a cast that included Simone Signoret and Lee Marvin, still working at the level where directors wanted her in the room. She accepted the role in a delicate balance and began preparing for rehearsals. 7 years. After the divorce. After the ECT. After the breakdown on the Elephant Walk set had replaced her with Elizabeth Taylor. After losing Notley Abbey. After losing the marriage. After 2 miscarriages and tuberculosis and an illness that had no treatment that worked. 7 years of showing up. Vivien Leigh died on July 8, 1967. She was 53 years old. Jack Marivalli, her companion since the divorce and the man who had promised Olivier he would take care of her, found her on the floor of her London flat. Tuberculosis, the illness that had first appeared in 1944 and been declared resolved. It had not been resolved. Her rehearsal notes for A Delicate Balance were on the table. She was still planning to work. She had been planning to work until the day her body stopped allowing it. That was the final statement. Not the 42 words, though those were the eloquent ones. The final statement was 7 years of refusing the role history had written for her. 7 years of choosing what she would be, rather than accepting what she had been told she had become. They could not take that back. No one objected. The record holds it. The machinery moved. It always does. Within months of the divorce, Laurence Olivier married Joan Plowright in a private ceremony. He was 53. She was 28. The press covered the wedding with warmth. A new chapter for the great man. A quieter life. A young wife who was, herself, a serious actress. Talented, respected, not prone to episodes. The contrast was not stated. It did not need to be. Olivier went on to greater formal recognition. In 1970, he became the first actor to be granted a life peerage, Baron Olivier of Brighton. He continued directing. He had 3 children with Joan Plowright. He worked until his body stopped working and died in 1989 at 82, celebrated as the definitive actor of the 20th century. The narrative about Vivien, meanwhile, was being quietly reassembled. It happened in layers, the way these things do. First layer, the illness. Every biography, every magazine profile, every documentary about Vivien Leigh that followed the divorce led with her mental illness. Not with the 2 Oscars. Not with the Tony she won in 1963, after the divorce, after the ECT, after everything. The illness came first, the way it always does when the world needs a reason to explain a woman's diminishment that doesn't involve the people who diminished her. Second layer, the framing of the marriage. Olivier's 1982 autobiography, Confessions of an Actor, described his experience of Vivien's illness in terms that centered his suffering. He wrote about the deadly, ever-tightening spirals of her manic depression. He wrote that the ECT had erased the best parts of her. He characterized 20 years of marriage to her as a form of endurance. The book was reviewed extensively. The reviews accepted his framing almost without question. He had survived a tragedy. She was the tragedy. What the autobiography did not dwell on: that he had been falling in love with Joan Plowright while Vivien was in a psychiatric hospital. That he had quietly begun building an exit while she was still fighting to stabilize. That the ECT burns on her temples were visible to audiences at her Broadway performances because she was still working, still performing, still showing up, and no one on that side of the story was writing ABO. UT it as courage. Third layer: the silencing of the specifics. Joan Plowright's name, which Vivien had so deliberately placed in the public record in May 1960, gradually receded from the standard version of the story. By the time most documentaries about Vivien Leigh were made, the divorce was described as the end of a great love, a natural conclusion to a turbulent relationship. Joan Plowright became a footnote. Vivien had named her. The name kept being put somewhere quieter. Fourth layer, and this one requires the most attention: the professional hierarchy that solidified after her death. In 1970, Laurence Olivier became Baron Olivier of Brighton, the first actor in the history of the British honours system to be granted a life peerage. He was 63 years old, remarried, raising 3 children, directing at the National Theatre. The decade after leaving Vivien had been, professionally, among the most decorated of his life. The contrast to what was happening to Vivien's reputation in the same period is not incidental. It is structural. She was being remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about mental illness and the price of burning too bright. The 2 Oscars were mentioned. The breakdowns were detailed. The ECT was described. The breakdown on the Elephant Walk set, being replaced by Elizabeth Taylor, was reliably included because it fit the story of decline the narrative required. What was rarely included in the standard version: that she had gone back to work afterward, that she had won a Tony, that she had kept working until the week she died, that the decline the narrative described was, in the primary sources, something considerably more complicated: a woman fighting an illness and continuing to produce extraordinary work, simultaneously, for 7 years. The machinery had not lied, exactly. It had simply chosen which facts to carry forward. But the original document existed. It had always existed. She spoke. They reframed. The paper did not change. And there was one more thing: the account from Jack Marivalli, her companion, the man who kept his promise to Olivier and looked after her until the end, told biographers that Olivier visited Vivien after the divorce, that he wrote to her, that he came by frequently to check on her, that they never spoke ill of each other, and that before Olivier died, he said to a friend of Vivien's, "This was love. This was the real thing." He said that in private, where it could not be verified easily, where it could not be placed in the record beside the autobiography, where it would have to be transmitted through intermediaries and survive on faith. She had said her piece in public. He said his in a hallway to a friend after she was already dead. She was 46 years old when the divorce was finalized. She would live 7 more years. But the counting of those years, the measuring of what they cost, that requires precision because the standard account gets it wrong. The standard account presents those 7 years as decline, a slow diminishment, the famous beauty losing ground to illness and grief, and the fundamental unfairness of being Vivien Leigh in an era that had no interest in treating what was actually wrong with her. That account is partially true, and it omits the most important part. She lost Notley Abbey, the medieval estate where she had arranged flowers in every room and filled the guest book with the 20th century. Gone in the divorce settlement. She would not have another home like it. She knew she would not. She lost the shape of her daily life. 23 years of building something with another person, the rhythms, the routines, the shared geography of a long marriage, and then the sudden absence of all of it at 46 with an illness that made stability its own kind of warfare. She lost the circle that had gathered around them as a couple. Some friends stayed. Noel Coward stayed loyal. Rex Harrison. John Gielgud. But the circle that had assembled itself around Lady Olivier and Sir Laurence, that specific constellation, it dispersed. It disperses when the center dissolves. And she lost what she had perhaps most needed to believe, that the man she had loved since she was 23 years old would choose to stay. But there were losses older than the divorce. Losses that belong in this accounting because they were never properly counted at the time. She miscarried twice. The first time was in 1944, after a fall on the set of Caesar and Cleopatra. She was 30 years old. The second miscarriage came in 1956, while she was rehearsing a stage production in London. Biographer Alan Strachan found her pocket diary from that period. He has described the entry for that day. The only thing written is 5 a.m., 2 characters. A time of night that means something went wrong while the rest of the world was asleep. She did not issue a statement about the miscarriages. She did not speak of them publicly. She grieved in the way women of her era were expected to grieve those losses, quietly, without ceremony, and while continuing to show up for everything that came next. Both losses contributed, according to accounts from those close to her, to the escalating severity of her episodes in the years that followed. The grief was real. It was also invisible. The world that watched the glamorous surface of Lady Olivier at premieres and first nights and Notley dinner parties had no access to the woman who had written 5 a.m. in a small diary and kept going. She carried that, without language for it, without the architecture we now understand to be necessary for surviving losses of that kind. She carried it and she worked. He did not choose to stay. He chose Joan Plowright. He chose a quieter life. He chose 3 children and a life peerage and the continued accumulation of distinction. He was not wrong to need something she could not give him. He was not a monster, but he left her while she was losing ground. And then he wrote a book about what it had cost him. Now go back to the statement. Read it again with everything you know. Lady Olivier wishes to say that Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce in order to marry Miss Joan Plowright. She will naturally do whatever he wishes. She wrote that from Broadway, in the middle of a run, while managing an illness no one around her fully understood. She wrote it without a pub licensed. She released it herself. Lady Olivier, the title used once. A closing of accounts. Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce in order to marry Miss Joan Plowright. No softening. The fact and the reason and the name. She will naturally do whatever he wishes. The blade was already in it. She had placed it there deliberately. Anyone reading carefully enough could feel exactly where it cut. It is, in 42 words, one of the most precisely weaponized acts of grief in the 20th century record. And she wrote it while she was still in pain. She was not over it when she wrote it. She was in the middle of it. She wrote it anyway, and she chose every word, and she released it before anyone could manage it into something softer. On July 8, 1967, Jack Mervalli found her on the floor of her London flat. Tuberculosis, 53 years old. Rehearsal notes for a delicate balance on the table. She was still planning to work. The biographies have kept coming. Hugo Vickers in 1988, and Edwards in the 1970s, the first to open the record on her illness publicly, the book that changed the conversation. Alan Strachan's Dark Star in 2019, built on secret correspondence between Vivien and Olivier, on diary entries, on interviews with the last living witnesses. Lindsay Spence's Where Madness Lies, The Double Life of Vivien Leigh, published in 2024, which begins deliberately not in 1939 with Scarlett O'Hara, not in 1940 with the marriage, but in 1953 with the breakdown. With the moment, the truth became impossible to contain, because that is where the actual story begins. Not in triumph, in crisis, and in every choice Vivien Leigh made inside the crisis, which were not the choices of a woman coming apart. They were the choices of a woman who understood exactly what was happening to her and refused to pretend otherwise. The record, assembled across 60 years of biography and letters and diary entries and press archives, says this: she did not disappear. After the divorce, after the hospitalization, after the ECT burns, after losing Notley Abbey, after the man she had loved for 23 years left to start a family with someone else. She went to Broadway and won a Tony Award. In 1963, 3 years after the divorce. For Tavares, a Broadway musical she had never attempted anything like before. The committee gave her the award anyway, unanimously, because she had earned it. She made The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone in 1961, a performance that critics praised without reservation. She made Ship of Fools in 1965 at 51 years old, still drawing reviews that acknowledged what she remained. She never spoke publicly against Olivier, not once, not in any interview, not in any letter that has since been published, not in any account from anyone who knew her. She held that line until she died. What the record cannot be made to say is that she was broken. It has been arranged to suggest that, many times by many writers working from Olivier's frame. But the primary sources, her own words, her own work, the contemporaneous accounts, will not hold the conclusion. What they hold is this: she was a woman with a severe and undertreated illness, living in an era with no effective medicine for it, married to a man who was both devoted and finally unable to stay, working at the highest level of her craft under conditions that would have ended most careers, making precise and deliberate choices about what to protect and what to name. And she named what needed naming. She named it in May 1960, in 42 words that no one has improved upon in the 60 years since. The record holds those words. The record will always hold those words. The record is the one thing they could not reframe, could not soften, could not privately correct. There are women whose story's history finally gets right. This is one of them, and the last word, as it should be, is hers. Lady Olivier wishes to say that Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce in order to marry Miss Joan Plowright. She will naturally do whatever he wishes. Vivien Leigh. Her voice. 42 words. On record. Forever. Old money scandals. If you stayed until the end, you understand why this story matters. Leave a comment. Share it. And we will be here with the next one.